Good morning, Shabbat Shalom, and welcome back once again. I'm Rabbi Ed Feinstein. This is Valley Beth Shalom Torah Study Online, and I'm joined this morning, which is our great blessing, by Rabbi Sherry Hirsch of the American Jewish University. Good morning, Sherry.
Good morning, Rabbi Feinstein.
And Rabbi Mark Gilman of South Florida. Good morning, Mark. Good to see you.
Good morning.
This morning's Torah study is devoted and dedicated to a wonderful, wonderful soul. Sherry's wonderful mother, Barbara Zwelling, was a dear friend of mine, friend of my family, and just the most elegant, sweet, and wonderful human being who left us way, way too long and left a gaping hole in the souls of our families and our communities. So this morning's learning, appropriately enough, is Kedoshim. Actually, the name of the Torah portion is a double one. It's Acharei Mot-Kedoshim, which is exactly correct. Acharei Mot is the first of the two Torah portions, which is a conclusion of the preceding sections of Leviticus and gives us the laws of how the sanctuary ought to be rededicated and cleansed every year. This is the reading that we do on Yom Kippur. It's an assurance to us that even the most carefully articulated set of rules, there's room in there for human weakness and human mistake, and a procedure for forgiveness and renewal within the structure of Jewish faith. And then we turn a page to an extraordinary group of mitzvot, extraordinary group of commandments. It's called the Holiness Code, begins with the watchword Kedoshim tihiyu ki kadosh ani Adonai. You will be kadosh, you will be sanctified, you will be holy. Moses says to the entire people of Israel, you will be holy because I, the Lord God, am holy. What does it mean to be kadosh? What is the essence of Kedusha? What is the meaning of bringing sanctity into our lives? Sherry, you want to begin? Memory of your mom?
Yes, first of all, thank you, Rabbi Feinstein and Rabbi Gilman. It's her yard site this past week, and there's never a day that I don't think about her, but especially during her yard site, it gives me an opportunity to learn with intention in her memory and ask some of the questions she would have asked. So Kedoshim is a perfect and fitting Parsha for her because she was, those that knew her knew she walked with holiness. And one of the things that she taught me is that she hated when people would say, I'm bad, I'm good, right? Like I ate badly today if they had treats and sweets, or I was so nasty, I'm bad, I'm good. She hated that binary model. And Buber presents a model of Kedoshim that I love, which is that there's holy and not yet holy. It's a different dichotomy. It's this idea that we are on a pathway to becoming more holy, right? It's not that we're bad or good or wrong or right. It's in fact the opposite. It's like we're in a process of becoming more and more holy in our lives. And with every action we take, whether we call it a mitzvah or whatever, we are moving towards a greater sense of holiness. And I love that framing, especially because I think my mother lived by that.
Mark, what is Kedusha? What does it mean to take upon oneself holiness or sanctity?
Well, it means that you're separating yourself from the profane, and the profane is the opposite of holy. I very much agree with Sherry. It's not binary. It's not good and bad. But what I take it to mean is the state of elevating yourself above the animal and into the spiritual. And in that I agree with, it's a process. It's something that we struggle with, and we reach closer to it one day and we fall back. I think it means to be set apart from the ordinary. That's the root meaning of Kedusha for me. Something that is set aside and occupies a different level of existence. It's the spiritual and not the material. It's the godly and not the profane. It's a way of embracing the parts of us that are not animal, that are not just instinctual, that are drawn to the knowledge that we are made in the image of God. And it's interesting to me that in the whole Torah, never does it say that we are holy. Never. Even in this verse, it doesn't say we're holy. It says, Kedoshim tihiyu, exactly as Sherry said it. We should strive to be holy because God is completely holy right now. God is holy completely. We are not. And in fact, it isn't until we're a corpse that the Torah says the corpse, the dead body is kadosh, completely kadosh. And so I think the impact of that interesting fact about laws of Kedusha is that we can't be holy when we're alive because we have free will and we're capable with that free will of making bad choices, which reduce our holiness. When we're dead, we're no longer able to make choices. And so we are the residue of God's creation, which is completely holy.
Wonderful. I want to propose a slightly different idea. Okay. You take the word kadosh, and by the way, it's a strange word. You know, we translate it in two ways. We use the word holy, and sometimes we use the word sacred, both of which connote something with great value, almost absolute value. But the real question is, what is the essence of that? And what kinds of things get put into the box that we designate as kadosh, as holy or sanctified? I want to suggest, and Mark is exactly right, one of the aspects of it is it's something set aside. It's something set apart. So Shabbat is holy because it's set aside from the rest of the week. The people Israel are holy because they are Am Kadosh, because they're set aside from the mass of humanity. A priest is holy because he is set aside from the populace. But I want to suggest there's a different way to read it, almost the exact opposite. And I think this is the genius of the Torah and the genius of the rabbis to really discover it. Look at the way we use the word. Let's play the game of analytic philosophy. What's the family association of the word? On Friday night, when I gather with my family, and these days it's over Zoom, it's not in person all the time, but on Friday night, when I gather with my family and community of friends, I raise a glass of wine and I recite a prayer called Kiddush, same word. Now, it's not the wine that's sacred, because the wine, my God, is just Manischewitz. What's sacred is the bond and circle of folks around the table, right? When two people are deeply in love and they declare their love and care and responsibility for one another, they stand beneath a chuppah and a ring is put on a finger and the words Harei at mikudeshet li, Harei ata mikudash li. You are kadosh to me. That process of bonding two human beings into one family is called kiddushin. And when we love someone deeply and they die, we stand up in the bonds of our community and declare that we're not separated from them eternally. We are connected with them always. And that prayer is called Kaddish. Kiddush, Kiddushin, Kaddish all denote bonding, turning the many into one, holding on to each other. And Mark is right. The opposite of kadosh, the opposite of holy is profane. And in Hebrew, the opposite of kadosh is chol. We have that blessing at Havdalah. We say hamavdil ben kodesh lechol. God who gives us the ability to share the ability to see the difference between that which is kadosh and that which is chol, profane, ordinary. But the word chol translates literally into the word sand. Now think about that for a minute. Sand. Kadosh and chol. You take a handful of sand at the beach. What happens to it? It falls out of your hand because the grains are atomized. They're all individual. They're one. There's nothing that sticks them together. Kadosh is that which sticks us together. And what God is saying is, Kedoshim tihiyu ki kadosh ani Adonai. You are to bond with each other and form a oneness and live a life of oneness because I, God, am the essence of oneness. You are to open the circle of your care and love and concern and to share your love and care and concern with all who share the world with you. Why? Because I, God, am the great circle of love that embraces everybody. And that's how I understand Kedusha. And then when you read each of the mitzvot, it's easy to see how then the mitzvot of this Torah portion The mitzvot of this Torah portion are an interpretation or an elaboration of that idea that we are to be one with each other. So which mitzvah of this particular Torah portion strikes you as the most interesting?
Well,
Sure.
wait,
Mark, you want to go ahead?
Before we do that,
All right, go ahead.
I think your description is beautiful. However, I think it points up the difficulty we have in determining what is kadosh. Your description is a description of ethically holy elements in the Torah, and how kadosh points us to those ethical principles, and that's all true. But I don't think it's enough of the truth to show the full variety of kadosh, which includes ritual holiness, which has nothing to do with ethics at all. For example, in the world of prostitutes, the Torah describes the ordinary prostitute as a zonah, but it describes the prostitutes who hung around at the temples, who were, I guess, more expensive call girls. These women were called Kedusha, kadosh. Now, that's certainly not ethical, but it was kadosh from the same root. Now we have to include that. What does that mean? That meant that they were set apart, not ethically, but ritually, like the laws that we'll see in this Parsha, like kilayim. Don't plant two different kinds of seeds. What nonsense is that? There's no ethical issue of planting two different seeds together. Or my favorite of all, shatnez, where you're wearing a coat that has wool and linen in it. There's no ethical issue about wearing a coat that has a liner on the sleeve that's linen and the coat is wool. That's ritual. That's the ritual element of Kedusha. And we have to somehow find a definition, Ed, that includes ethical Kedusha and ritual Kedusha. And I haven't found that yet in my life.
All right, I'm going to challenge that only to this extent. I don't disagree completely, but I think that the challenge of this is to discover in what way even the ritual things form a moral language for us to embrace. Form a moral language. The cultic prostitute in Canaanite religion, women and men used sexual gestures as a way of worshiping the Canaanite gods of fertility. The Torah prohibits this completely. The Torah finds this an abomination. It doesn't take too much imagination to see that this is part of a bigger idea, that sexuality is not instrumental. It's not something for buying off the favors of the God or buying off anyone's favors. What you're being told here is that sexuality has to be a completely unconditional gesture of love, of care, of affection, of connection between human beings, and doesn't become an instrumental, a kind of prostitution where you're trading a transaction, where you're trading one thing for another. The same thing with these other mitzvot. Let me just give you a small example in our own existence. We raised our children, we raised them keeping kosher. So we would occasionally, and even in a rabbi's house, you end up with arguments. Why can't I have ice cream? Because we just had a chicken dinner. I want to have ice cream. I know you want to have it, but we don't do that. That's not the way we eat, right? Now, what happens there? You've taught the child something very important, that for the purpose of a higher principle, sometimes we give up the things that we desire, or we give them up in some temporary kind of fashion. So there was one day, and I've told this story before, so I apologize for repeating it, but when we first got a computer in the house, my son, who was 13 at the time, happened upon one of these websites that you wouldn't imagine a rabbi's kid would be looking at. All right, he's a healthy kid, and he's looking at these things. And as I walk by, he tries to hide it, When I was a kid, I tried to hide the Playboy magazine under my bed from my mother. And he tried to hide this picture on the computer, and he couldn't possibly do it. So we sat down and had a talk. And I said, listen, you're a healthy kid. I understand what you're looking at, but let's talk about something. That woman, what do you see when you see her? Do you see her soul? Do you see her individuality, her uniqueness, her preciousness? And he said, no, Papa, she's just hot. And I said, yeah, that's the problem. That's the private. In the same way that we've taught a child that things that are desirable are not always the best that we can do ethically. So I think that, Mark, you're right. And what I would say is that holiness is an image of the best we are ethically. It's not the moral floor. It's the moral, as it were, aspiration. The
Well, how does the
ceiling.
Kedusha fit
Can I
into
control my masculine? Because you're not to use sexuality as an instrument, a transaction. That's what it's for. If I'm just using it, maybe that's not the right answer to it, but I'm trying to use this category to understand my religion. That's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to find an ethical reason for these things.
I just think,
right? Sherry, pick which mitzvah.
You're forcing it into a mold that it doesn't want to be in. A Kedusha is called a Kedusha.
Okay, that's fair.
Okay. I was going to say, I just want to add to what you just said. Right. And there may be exceptions. I mean, lahekdesh is to separate, right? To make separate. And so there may be that it works in multiple instances, but doesn't work in them all. I feel like I'm Switzerland right now, right? Like, but I just want to add something to what you said, Eddie, about kashrut, because it's such a telling thing. Last week we were in Louisiana, which is like the hotbed of treif. I don't even know, like every order is like a complicated order from our house. And we ended up getting this kosher meat for dinner. It was this whole thing. And then, of course, they came out and said to us, and we have this phenomenal tiramisu. It was like a whole schmobile. And I said to Levi, said, Mom, can't we just wait like 15 minutes and, do it, have the tiramisu, da, 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 da. And I said, we're Jews and we create distinction in our life, but we can order that dessert tomorrow, bring it home. We can order it tonight, bring it home and eat it in 3 hours or eat it tomorrow. And the conversation that evolved out of that was so beautiful because it really lent itself to, no, we don't just do things willy-nilly. We don't just dive into things. We are on a path towards holiness. And that means also making sacrifices, which is what a point that I think you were saying, Eddie, is that those points of sacrifices are opportunities for learning. So it made me think of that. So I appreciate that. Favorite mitzvah in Kedoshim. So I would have never said this before I became the mother of 3 teenagers, but kavod av v'em, which is that you have to respect and honor your parents, throws me, because normally I'm like, okay, it's overdone. Everybody talks about it. But now I am the parent of 3 teenagers. And that is really hard because we're not talking that they're abusive, but they're nasty. In order to individuate, they have to developmentally be disrespectful sometimes. And it really has made me question this mitzvah, like to what degree have they crossed the line? And to what degree do I say to them, you're no longer respecting and honoring me. You've now crossed the line. And to what degree do I say like, okay, you're developmentally appropriate. This is teenagehood, but I'm having a lot of issues with it. And I hear this mitzvah constantly echoing in my head now in a way that it never has.
And it's a wonderful point to make as we remember your beautiful mother, because you had you had a very, very unique relationship with her, and what you're going through is I think all of us who have raised kids have had these moments when we wondered like, now wait a minute. Now, wait a minute.
Well, and I think to myself, I didn't sign up for this. I wasn't this kind of teenager. It's not the relationship I had with my mother. And it was a very different dynamic in my childhood. So of course it was a different relationship, but it really has made me, I want to like plaster this mitzvah in the middle of the living room and like point to it like I would the ketubah, and say like, note to all the 3 people that just had dinner that was supplied by your mother. Read the sign, right? There's a part of me that wants to start plastering it across the house, really.
Okay.
Which I'm not far from doing at this point.
Listen, the Torah had the same idea, but mezuzahs on all the doors.
Right. We're on lockdown for, X amount of months. We're pretty sick of each other. And then you throw in 3 teenagers and this mitzvah becomes understood in an entirely new way. Entirely new.
Mark, what's your favorite mitzvah in Kedoshim?
Well, it's my favorite mitzvah in life. It turns out it's, I think, the greatest verse of the Torah. I think it's the greatest law in the Torah. When I worked with Tommy on the book Religion for Dummies, we looked at all the religions we studied, and the only thing we found that was identical in every religion we studied was they all had some version of the golden rule. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Ahavta l'recha kamocha. Ani Adonai, I am God. People forget the ending of it, that you don't love your neighbor as you love yourself just for some abstract philosophical or ethical principle. You love your neighbor as yourself because I am God, as God said, which is you love them because you see in them the image of God that you're supposed to see in everyone. And that to me is the greatest of all the mitzvot. Hillel said it, and it's in Buddhism, it's in the Sharia, in Islam, it's in Hinduism. Even in religions that had no contact with the Torah, in First People's teachings, the Wakanda Sioux have it, the Tiwi of North Australia have it. It's quite extraordinary that people on their own, without
Wait, did you just say the Wakanda Sioux?
Yeah.
Who are they? Sorry.
The Sioux, we used to call them Indians.
Oh.
American Indians.
Oh, I literally thought you were doing something from a Marvel movie, like Back to Wakanda. I mean, I had no idea what you were saying.
Oh, no, it's the American Indian.
I'm sure there they have the same rule too.
First people. We now say first people.
Right. For every listener that was fully knowledgeable about what Mark just referred to, I apologize. And for everyone that wasn't, you can join my club.
Okay. And I'm sure in Wakanda, the Black Panther also had it. But
Mark, why? But let's pursue this for a second.
Oh, because
why does every culture have that rule?
Because the essence of ethical behavior is to engage in self-transcending actions. That you're acting not just for yourself, but for the good of something other than you. It's not just self-interest. And what's great about, transcendent about this law is it says, even if you pursue ethics as a way of acting in your own self-interest, you should know that your own self-love is the foundation for the love of others. Because if you ask yourself, why do you love yourself? You know, why is that easy for people? Selfishness. Why do you love yourself? Well, because you think you're special. Well, what's the source of your specialness? Well, the source is, you know, if you think about it in a theological way, God made me in God's image. Okay, great. Time out. Are you the only one God made in God's image? No. Other people have the same claim. And because they have the same claim, you recognize in them the qualities you see in yourself. And that's why Immanuel Kant made this, the golden rule, the foundation of his ethical principle, the categorical imperative, which he outlines in the Critique of Practical Reasoning, which is to act only on that maxim which you would will to be a universal law of nature. And that principle, in a highly abstract philosophical sense, is exactly what the Ahavta l'recha kamocha means. It means you should always act on a principle that any person in that situation should do that thing. Any X should do that Y. And that's what makes something ethical. What makes something ritual, to get back to my distinction between ritual Kedusha and ethical Kedusha, which I still think, Eddie, you need to integrate into your system. The difference there is that ritual Kedusha cannot be universalized. You can't say everyone should not mix wool and linen in their garments. Only Jews do that. So you can't universalize it. But you shall not steal. That is a universalizable maxim. No one should steal, not just Jews. And because of that, it's an ethical law. And this Parsha because it's pre-philosophical, doesn't have the distinctions that we can now use. Hermann Cohn did this famously in his writings, and Buber to some degree, and Rosenzweig to a much deeper degree through his study of Hegel. And that is, we all of us have to understand that unless you can make something a universal law, it is not ethical. And that is why it may be good to wait until you have ice cream after you have a meat meal. I'm not arguing that. And I'm not arguing whether you should or shouldn't do that. What I am arguing is that it is absolutely not sustainable. It is not true. It can't be supported to say that that principle of not eating ice cream until 3 hours have passed after a meat meal is an ethical law. It's not. It's a ritual law. And you may choose to observe it, you may not. And the reason I am a Reformed Jew and not an Orthodox Jew is precisely because that distinction is at the heart of all liberal Judaism, Reform and conservative. That ethical laws are in Judaism are obligatory because they're universalizable. Ritual laws in Judaism are not obligatory in the same way. That's it.
I appreciate the distinction, but I'm going to push back again.
Okay.
I'm going to push back again. Ritual laws are not universalizable or not universal in their particulars, but they are in their intent. I'll give you an example. We stop on red lights and we go on green lights. You could imagine a society where you stop on a green light and go on a red light. You can imagine a society where they have purple and yellow lights or purple and other colored lights, but you can't imagine a society that allows traffic to go any which way it wants to go without having stops and goes. Because the only way to keep from bumping into each other is to have stoplights of some fashion or another. In the same way, you're right. There's nothing universalizable about waiting a couple of hours, 3 hours, or 2 hours, or 6 hours, whatever hours you choose between milk and meat, between meat and milk. But there's something completely universalizable, first of all, about recognizing the moral difference between milk and meat, that which gives life and that which takes life. And there's everything ethical to say that I'm going to teach my child that sometimes he has to control his desires in order to be part of a larger human community and in order to be the kind of human being he wants to be. And that's the ethics behind what you call the ritual. And the reason, and I agree with you, you and I live a very, very similar Jewish life. It's not because I'm not Orthodox. That's not the issue. To me, the issue is ethics have to come first. And we'll talk about this in a moment, but if there are religious laws which I deem unethical, I don't do them. And I'm going to ask that question independently of what it might say in the text. Geschrieben, it's written, is not an answer to me. It wasn't an answer to Maimonides, wasn't an answer to my teacher, Harold Schulweis. It's not an answer to me. I want to know how this contributes to my ethical development, to my moral development, and to the ethical world that I live in. I don't think that the distinction is nearly as strong as you've drawn it. Now, my favorite law here, and I love the ones you've put together. They're just beautiful. I mean, everybody wants very much to honor their mother and father, and certainly want our teenage kids to honor us. But it's not easy. And then all of us want to honor, and I love the great moral principle of Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. Here too, I would reemphasize my emphasis on my thesis of oneness, because the phrasing of the law is very interesting. Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, you will love the other. Now then that word kamocha, ve'ahavta, you will love, l'reacha is the other, your neighbor, kamocha. Does kamocha modify ahava, the kind of love you have? Like you will love him as you love yourself? Or does kamocha modify l'reacha? You will love the other because he is just like you, because in some fashion he is you, because you are part of one human circle. And to see yourselves indelibly separated from each other and to see his fate and your fate as somehow different is a complete illusion, and it's a complete lie. You are one human society, one human circle, living on one pretty small, fragile planet. Learn to love the other because he is you. He is connected to you indelibly. That's how I like to read that law. But my favorite one is the one that just comes just before that one. It's a law that I learned when I was a little kid in Hebrew school, right? You will not curse the deaf. You will not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block in front of the blind. We were little kids, like, who would do such a thing? First of all, who would try to stumble a blind person? But you understand that that's not what the law is really about. The law is about don't put people in conditions where they're liable to fail. And then cursing the deaf, that's a brilliant one. Because the next line of the Torah is Ani Adonai, I'm God. See, you may shout something horrible at a deaf person and he doesn't hear it. But the idea that there's that Ani Adonai, but it does something to the moral environment in which you live. I am God. And it's not when I was a kid and I thought God was listening and God will punish you. It's bigger than that. You will hear it. It will do something to your moral development. To curse the deaf, to curse those who can't, even those who can't hear, to carry that kind of animus within you, to schlep hatred into the world and viciousness into the world. That's not the kind of human being I want you to be, says God. You've got to strive to be a better person. You've got to strive to be a holier person, a person who acknowledges your oneness with all who share the world with you. That's how I like to read that law. Let's take a look now at the end of the Torah portion, because here I know Rabbi Gelman has something which is very, very important, because this Torah portion not only has this remarkably lofty moral vision, but it has some other stuff in there. Mark, what is it that bothers you about the end of the Torah portion?
Well, there's actually a segue from what you just said, and that's if for me to push back on your pushback, it's to say, if we are willing to at least entertain the idea that Kedusha includes ritual items that have no ethical valence, though they could, with an interpretation, be pulled that way by brilliant expositors of the law like you, Eddie. But if we agree that there are in fact ritual aspects of Kedusha that are not universal, and ethical elements of Kedusha that are, then, and if my history review of liberal Judaism is correct, which is that the principle of liberal Judaism is the ethical laws of the Kedusha of the Torah are binding on us, and the ritual laws of the Torah may be binding, may not be, but they're not binding ab initio. So if that's true, then it should be that the ritual laws of the ethical laws of the Torah, the ethical laws, are all correct, more or less all correct. And the ritual laws, you can shmedre them, you can alter them, depending on historical circumstances or other reasons. Well, what happens if one of the ethical laws of the Torah, a law that's clearly intended to apply to everyone and not just Jews, is wrong? What if it isn't just wrong, but oppressive? What if it's not just oppressive, but virulent? What if it destroys human self-flourishing? What if it does that? Something that we think came from God. What if it does that? Now, an argument can be made, and it has been made by me in previous weeks, that one of those moments is the Torah's support of slavery. This week, we have something equally bad, and that is its support of anti-gay prejudice and even, let me say, violence, since it's in the context of a capital offense. And that is 2013, you shall not lie with a man the way you lie with a woman, the prohibition against male homosexuality. I consider this to be so profoundly wrong that I feel honestly shame at it being in the Torah, partly because I have so many gay friends. Almost every one of my professors in my doctoral work at Northwestern were gay men, my wife's oldest friend is gay. Members of my family are gay. And the idea that the Torah has played a role in anti-gay prejudice, which is clearly true because of this law, fills me with shame. Because we're not talking about homosexuality as rape, that's what's really being condemned here. That's not true. We're not talking about pederasty of homosexually assaulting children. We're talking about consensual sex and love, because sex is a manifestation of love between two men, consensual sex between two men. The issue of women is another matter, but it falls into the same thing. There's no doubt the Torah opposed that too. And so I reject, not only do I reject it, but I'm shaken at my core, because this is an ethical law that is wrong. In fact, it's with slavery, two of the only ethical laws I've encountered in the Torah that cannot be defended. And that's my agony. Even though I have ecstasy in this Parsha with V'ahavta l'recha kamocha, the highest part of the Torah and the lowest part of the Torah occur in the same Parsha.
As a reader of Torah, I appreciate you. I appreciate what you said, Mark, and I completely agree with your moral passion, and in a certain way your disgust with this, for the same reason, for the people who I love, for whom this is an anathema, just a curse, and for the generations for whom it's been a curse. In a certain way, for a reader of the Torah, though, to celebrate the beauty of those mitzvot, Kedoshim, is a sort of easy thing to do. Each of us can say, that's my favorite mitzvah. Here is the moral import of this mitzvah, how much I would love to teach this mitzvah to the world. What you've done here is much more difficult. It's much more difficult to take on the harder parts of the Torah and to recognize them, to figure out, what do you do with them? What do you do with them? And you and I have both been in encounters where we have said to people, this is a part of the Torah that I can't abide by. And the answer that you get from certain people is, well, but that's what's written. God says it. You have no choice but to accept it. And you and I have both, and Sherry many times as well, of course, as sensitive readers of Torah, because we understand that that's an offense to the Torah. It's not just an offense to us. There's blasphemy in that. Because if you're reading the Torah and it comes out to be something that's so grossly immoral, so horribly anti-life, so horribly destructive, you're insulting the Torah. You're insulting the Torah. And from the very beginning, the Torah asks us to do something. Remember, the first Rashi on Torah says, Eina mikra zemer ela darsheni. Torah demands that you become a partner in understanding it. And when Abraham is standing in front of God before Sodom and Gomorrah, what does Abraham say? Abraham doesn't say, yes, sir, go do whatever you're going to do. You're God. Everything you do is right. No, Abraham says, Hashofet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat. You, God, have to do justice, and God changes God's mind. We have to come to Torah with our moral sensibilities intact. And if you read something in Torah which offends, which hurts, you've got to say, no, it's not right. Now, that's a radical thing, because that makes people feel very shaky. It means that there's no moral absolutism, even in reading of the Torah, but that's exactly the maturity, the moral maturity which this kind of religious life demands of us. Now, what do you do with a law like this? You could set it aside, which the rabbis did with numerous laws in the Torah. There's a law later on, we're going to get to it later this summer, that says, here's for Sherry, by the way, if you have a teenager who's intransigent and stubborn and difficult, take him to the elders of the town and we'll kill him for you. Or her in your case, and you say, oh, I'm going to put that one up in the kid's bedroom, right? But the rabbi said, lo hayav velo atid lihiyot. We will never observe this law because it is morally despicable. It's just not the way we choose to live in the world. That's one option. And a second option is to find a context and interpretation which granted is a form of eisegesis. I'm forcing an interpretation in, but that's what I'm going to do because I want to show that there is something here that is salvageable. I would take the law that you read and I would say it's not about responsible, loving homosexual relationships. It's not about consensual sex between two loving partners. It's quite the opposite. That what the Torah is talking about here is something which was not uncommon in the ancient world. And God knows, unfortunately, it's not uncommon in this world, which is two human beings where sex is used as a weapon, where sex is used as an expression of domination. Look, even in our vernacular, even in our slang, we use the words for sexual contact to mean taking over somebody. You really did it to him, you know. I mean, think about what that means. That means the most intimate, loving, mutual act of care is turned into an act of control and destruction. And the Torah says that is an anathema. That's how I
see that. Where do you see that in this verse?
That I'm not denying that it's my own eisegesis. I'm pushing that into the verse. If you rape a man the way that a woman is often raped in our culture, and that's the way it was in the ancient world, you know that. And unfortunately, it's often done in this world too. If sex becomes an expression of dominance and of control and of destruction of the other, instead of loving the other as one loves oneself, that's what the law, that's my context for the law. And now I can read the law and not be totally disgusted by it. But I don't disagree with your moral passion at all.
And I would add, Eddie, that the responsibility of looking at those parts of the Torah, as Mark suggests, that are difficult, challenging, ethically corrupt, is letting us end where we began. That is the quest for holiness. That is very much the act of becoming holier, right? It's not saying this is the Torah, this is what we got. It's wrestling with that. I think that is in fact what it means to become kadosh. So I applaud both of you for that, because it's the ignorant that turns a blind eye to that is not on the pursuit of holiness.
And it comes from your reading of the rest of the Torah, because you do understand that each is created in the image of God and that each is deserving of dignity and of care. Mark, you're shaking your head.
I think the Torah, I have a different
Go ahead.
saving technique.
Okay.
My saving technique is the Torah intended us to reject that verse.
Fair enough.
And the reason it intended us to reject that verse is that it included Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha in this chapter, in this Parsha. And that is, if you really love your neighbor as yourself, that includes loving your gay neighbor as yourself. So you cannot observe the Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha and do not lie with a man the way you lie with a woman. You can't reconcile those. You have to choose. And the Torah is saying, look, here is a completely offensive local custom that the ancient world is going to try to get you to observe. I'm putting it in the Torah to see how many of you have the guts to realize that the Torah is written on many levels. And I am not just giving you the high level Torah. You have to find that high level. The Torah isn't just something you just take and hold. You have to take and interpret it like Rashi wants and turn it, and it's all there. And that is the intention. The intention is to find the high Torah. And the same was true in the Evet Olam, in that Parsha where we have slavery. We also have a release, and we also have freedom. And so I think that that's what this is about. But the end result of it is that, for me as a philosopher, it means that we cannot read the Torah without an external philosophical critique. We have to have a standard of what's right and wrong that we can apply to the Torah. We can't just say this is what it says and that's what we do. That's fundamentalism, and that's wrong. That's always wrong. And we certainly can't say, well, when we come to a part that we don't like, we'll just sort of twist it and turn it and mangle it so that we have something in there that we can like. That's just exegesis, and it's a way of defending things irrationally. The third way is to say, look, we have to have a standard like Kant's categorical imperative, or like love your neighbor as yourself. And that standard has to be applied to all the laws of the Torah, because the Torah is partly written by people with their ancient prejudices, and in this case, modern prejudices as well. And it's also written by God and given to us by God, so that we can take the parts written by God and use them to reject the parts of the Torah that were written by man.
And so, ladies and gentlemen, you have just seen Israel, Yisrael, he who wrestles with God and wins. Right? This is what I'm very serious. This is what it means. The Torah is not not something to only be embraced. Of course, we embrace it. Torah is to be wrestled with. Right, and the only I mean I use a different interpretive technique than you do, Mark. Not I would suggest that yours is even more radical than mine, right? But in the end, but here's the point: that external philosophical, I would call it moral standard by which we measure the laws of Torah, that too comes from Torah. That too comes from the insight that every human soul is created in the image of God. That too comes from the commandment to love the other as you love yourself. That too says, don't put a stumbling block before the blind, right? Don't give people an opening to express their worst impulses. Teach them how to live. Teach them how to live a moral life. Give them a moral vocabulary. All of that is Torah also. And that's the wrestling that one has to do. One has to read as an intelligent reader. Sherry, you had one last comment. I saw it on your face.
Well, I would just say that I agreed with the Seifa, the ending part of what Mark said about wrestling, but the Resha, the beginning part, which is that the Torah placed these verses in there for us to recognize and reject them, I think is a big stretch and obviously a conversation for another day.
That's very good.
I'm not buying that.
Very good. Well, Sherry, in memory of your beautiful mother, who we remember with great love, she loved everyone that she met and showered her love and affection on everyone. Let us strive to live to that standard. Mark, I wish you a very good Shabbos. Find some peace in this week's Torah portion, right? Sherry, a very good Shabbos, and to everyone who's joined us this morning. This morning, following this Torah study, we're going to be joining Valley Beth Shalom's Neshama Minyan, led by Rabbi Nina Bieber Feinstein, someone very close to me, and Cindy Paley. It's a beautiful spiritual musical service. That's our service for this week. And if you've never been to Neshama Minyan, I encourage you to stay on and stay on Facebook and watch it with us. It is a beautiful, beautiful, remarkable service. And we'll hope that you'll enjoy Nina's insights, Cindy's music, and the beautiful spirit of that minyan. This week, Rabbi Silverman is recovering from a medical condition. I'm told that he's going to be fine, so he won't be on this week, but we wish him a refuah shlema to be well, and he'll be with us next week. He's so anxious to teach this Torah portion that you're going to be hearing it for a couple of more weeks with Rabbi Silverman. And I'll be teaching this week, of course, on Wednesday afternoon, Lunch and Learn at 12:30, and Wednesday evening, College of Jewish Studies. And we're actually going to take up this story, this question, the question of this week for College of Jewish Studies in our series on the questions that don't go away is the Torah true? And that's this week's conversation. So join us, please, Wednesday night at 7 o'clock. Have a very, very, very good week, a very, very good Shabbos, and a sweet, quiet weekend. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.